Hi, I'm Professor Ken Harvey of Xiamen University, and this is a quick video related to the question, who is the purveyor of fake news, and can you identify it? I would need to move the video here a little bit. The one claim is that traditional news media are the source of accurate news and the protector of the public from fake news. There are some very good videos that I recommend. One by the former Newsday executive editor, who has started a course and kind of a movement around the world about news literacy. In his presentation here, that he denies that there's bias in the media, and that I think he goes too far. However, he does also offer a lot of other interesting insights and research about news media and about news in general and about how we think and perceive. There were then a series of videos created kind of on this topic, and so at this website you can find some additional videos on the idea of news literacy. I would also recommend some other videos that take a different perspective. Move this up a little bit. Oops, there we are. Claims that traditional media have become a source of fake news. Sharyl Attkisson is an award-winning TV investigative reporter who for more than 20 years reported for CBS-TV News and CNN. She quit and discussed a few years ago as she saw trends that bothered her and biases that began to creep into the business. Here are three fairly long videos, however, about actually shorter than the one by the former Newsday executive editor, but filled with examples of problems that she has seen and experienced among the traditional news media in America. And I recommend those. Brent Bozell is an author and head. Where do I move myself now? There he is. I'm going to put myself right on top of him, though. He's an author and head of the Media Research Center. I will acknowledge that this research center comes with some of a bias, but I think their reporting on current problems in the media is fairly accurate from what I've seen and experienced as a news researcher and a news practitioner. And so there's two short presentations here. These are fairly short about what he's saying specifically about the news coverage on President Donald Trump that bothers him. Glenn Beck is a popular American news commentator, also conservative, as is Brent Bozell. Sharyl Attkisson, by the way, I think is pretty much middle of the road. She has currently found herself, you might say, supporting President Trump on a number of issues, but she has over the years investigated both conservative and liberal politicians and has not taken a strong side one way or the other. She is concerned with the media coverage of President Trump and some of the biases that they are reflecting in that, along with many other topics that don't actually even relate to politics. Some of her examples come from the impact of special interest on news coverage for, by business special interests, for example. The producers of different medicines and drugs is included as one of her examples. So she takes a much broader look. But anyway, Brent Bozell does content analysis, especially of news coverage in politics. And while he specifically has a bias, I think his analysis in this case is accurate. Anyway, Glenn Beck is again a conservative American news commentator, and his comments here come from another source that he will provide, but it's somewhat alarming as to the control of new media. So now we're not talking about traditional media, but in his case, he's talking about new media, online social media, for example, and search engine control of search engines by also people from a particular political perspective. Now, perennially, and again, let me move my image here a little bit. For years, liberal academics have been concerned about the concentration of power among the owners of media, not just news media, but also entertainment media. But you see here, for example, that there are 6 companies that control 90% of the traditional media that Americans consume. And so GE, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS all control major enterprises within the media community, including essentially all of the news media, or all of the major, well, the top media, let me put it that way. It's both conservative and liberal. News Corp, for example, controls the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, and the New York Post, representing moderate to conservative media. Whereas GE controls NBC, which is seen as more liberal, a major cable company, Comcast. Disney controls ABC TV, including ABC News. Some other more entertainment and sports enterprises. Viacom controls mostly entertainment related media. Time Warner controls CNN. That's a major news source. Time Magazine, as well as many entertainment companies. And CBS owns itself. Its news programming and so forth, as well as a lot of other entertainment. Another major media, 60 Minutes, is actually a major TV program within CBS, but it has been rated #1 in many of the past years. So these are all major players in America and become major players worldwide, not to the extent that they control media in America. And so the perspective from academics has been that these guys are evil. And I'm not saying there's not a problem, but I want to kind of spread the blame a little bit and explain. And I know Sharyl Attkisson is concerned about the concentration of media in a relatively few hands, and she has, you might say, evidence that there is some control of content being exhibited by the corporations now, more so since I personally left the news industry and went back into academia. So what she saw was about that time that I left the news industry, at least as a full-time participant. She saw some major things occurring. And so this is, again, I'm kind of in the way here, so I'll move up here. Again, if you look at it, just a different way of looking at the control of a few major companies over many news sources and other media sources. John Pilger, who's from Australia, is a researcher and commentator on the media, and created a major documentary called The Invisible Government. He makes note that in 1983 there were 50 corporations, mostly American corporations, that pretty much controlled the global media. But by 2002, it's 9 corporations, and now reflecting the graphics I just showed you, 5 to 6 corporations. And so to him, control is going beyond just America, but are also controlling media around the world. Not to the degree that they're controlling in America, but of course Rupert Murdoch is also from Australia, so he is owning, the media he owns are worldwide. Rupert Murdoch himself predicted that there will soon be just 3 mega corporations, and so this again is cause to worry. Pilger in his documentary and writings mentions many detrimental results from powerful media and their impact on government. They've started wars, for example, promulgated conflicts. So this is of concern, and I'm not going to downplay it. But there are other factors also. It gets more complicated. For example, there are lots of counter organizations, smaller media, that resist the conglomeration of media. There are university and public media, such as National Public Radio and public broadcasting system. There's advocacy media, alternative media like Now Toronto, Village Voice, still independent media. So the counter conglomerates often cannot compete with the bigger companies, still often, and they're often bought out by larger competition. But they are still, their presence is significant. And I would say this is where there's lots and lots of counter conglomeration going on online, and we'll come back to online media in a second. But that, since it's so easy and so inexpensive to create an online medium, this is a growing aspect of news media. And there's also an issue that even within corporations, it becomes a little bit corporate executives versus journalists. When the professors, mostly liberal, express their concerns about these conglomerates, they take it from the perspective that these conglomerates are naturally conservative. And actually that's many times not true. I used to work for the McClatchy news organization, which became one of the largest news conglomerates in America. And actually it's not in that list. But anyway, McClatchy is very liberal, just like many of the online media are very liberal. So you have liberal sources as well as conservatives. But my point in the next few slides is to point out that journalists exhibit more control over what we call news than do executives. In my years, I saw some examples of where corporations controlled the news. They dictated what the journalists could cover. But I also, at McClatchy, I didn't see that. McClatchy, like I said, is very liberal, and I was conservative. And so we clashed sometimes in news coverage and what I felt was biased coverage. I guess there wouldn't be conflict between the corporation and the news executives if they all have the same belief, and I'd say that's true. That it'd probably be almost impossible for a conservative to become an executive editor of one of the McClatchy properties, and so that's it reflects the corporation, but definitely not in a conservative way. But corporations still can show some bias, as Sharyl Attkisson suggests in her videos. So anyway, going back to the idea of the impact of the journalists themselves, just to kind of put things in perspective, you notice here in this chart, in this slide, that America is pretty split between conservative and liberal as far as how the citizens think. And consequently, you see that the Democrat presidential candidates and Republican presidential candidates have pretty much switched on and off, on and off, on and off. So back in the 1950s, there's Eisenhower, Republican, and then in the 1960s, the Democrats controlled the presidency in America most of the time between Kennedy and Johnson. Nixon took over. After he resigned, Ford took his place, but was not, he ran for election, but Carter beat him, who was a Democrat. Then Reagan enjoyed 8 years, and the first George Bush then had a 4-year term, 12 years of Republicans. Then Clinton came along, and despite his indiscretions, survived 8 years. The second George Bush served 8 years. The Democrat Obama served 8 years, and now not in this list is Donald Trump, who is in his first term. So you see that as far as the election of presidents, you see that Americans have gone back and forth between Democrats and Republicans, and in a sense, the independents have controlled who becomes president. In a survey by Gallup, this is a little bit old, and so it may not be accurate anymore, but at the time they did this particular survey, more people in America identified themselves as conservative than they did liberal. But there were also a large moderate portion in between that might be those that would call themselves independent in the elections and ultimately control who wins the presidency. But we've also had, during the last few decades, we've had a number of surveys where journalists themselves have self-identified who they are, what their leanings are. And even though sometimes, I think now more than ever, they might, as shown I think in the second survey here in this slide, might be trying to shed the label of being liberal. I'd say many of them are claiming to be moderate when they're really not. They are liberal. So I would say that's not truly accurate. And over the years, they've decided that's politically or economically better to claim to be moderate. But on the left side, we have a survey of the editors themselves, and it's basically 4-to-1 liberals to conservative. But even in this one to the right, the statistics on the right, you see there are basically 5 journalists who are willing to label themselves as liberal, as opposed to 5-to-1 compared to those who are willing to label themselves as conservative. Now, from my experience and from what we're seeing right now, in reality, I would say that there is no way there's 54% moderate, that it has become much more polarized than that. And and probably those moderate could be divided pretty much in the same proportion as those willing to identify themselves either liberal or conservative. That there are indeed about 5 times as many liberals as there are conservatives, even if they want to call themselves moderate. And so consequently, as there's the Center for Media and Public Affairs at George Mason University is an academic organization, is not, to my knowledge, particularly liberal or conservative. Although I think basically after the first Barack Obama election, they between that and going back to, I believe, the first George Bush president's, or at least election, they had been following and doing a content analysis of news on each election until after the first Obama election. Then suddenly they're not doing it anymore. And I think there's probably more interest now than ever. And so I have to think that somebody basically decided for them that they were not going to study this anymore. But going back and looking at McCain versus Obama, and that in Obama's first victory, you see here that there were more than or about twice as many negative stories about McCain as there were about Obama, and there were more than twice as many favorable stories about Obama than there were about McCain. And so, if the news coverage had not been so lopsided, Obama had spent almost twice as much money on his campaign than did McCain, and yet he only won with a 53% vote. So it would not take him much of a swing in voting for McCain to have won, and that difference could easily have been made by what appears to be bias in news reporting. In fact, since then it looks even more like bias, because especially after Trump won, McCain suddenly became the darling of the liberal press. And they were, Trump was criticizing McCain, and the media jumped all over Trump because of his criticism. And when McCain died, they glorified him. But while he ran for president, they demonized him. So it does seem like suddenly they gained a different perspective when it's to their advantage. Moving my face again, if I can. Here I am. In the prior election between George Bush, number 2, and John Kerry, we saw almost the same breakdown of negative to positive stories between Bush, the Republican, Kerry, the Democrat. Same as McCain was the Republican and Obama the Democrat. So we saw pretty much the same breakdown, is that Kerry had less than half as many negative stories written about him, and he had more than twice as many favorable stories. So while Bush won easily, it certainly wasn't because the media was helping him. There have been some good studies about prejudice in the media that the former executive editor of Newsday, who teaches the news literacy course and led that movement, ignores. In this one, it was a study by a UCLA professor and a University of Missouri professor who hired 21 research assistants who were evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. And the bottom line of this is that they asked one simple question. They had them go through the news coverage of the top 20 news media in America. And in order to classify their sources, either liberal or conservative, both the person who voted for Kerry, I think it would have been, or the one that voted for Bush, had to agree whether it was liberal or conservative source. And what they found was that 18 of the top 20 news media in America were using more liberal sources than conservative sources, and in some case to a very, very large degree. Now, these numbers here are not reflective directly of the percentage of excessive liberal professors, but they were using an analytical tool that had been created for comparing how conservative or liberal congressmen were, and this is kind of a rating. It is interesting, however, that even though it's owned by a conservative news organization, the Wall Street Journal was actually the most liberal, used more liberal sources than any of the other top 20 news sources or news media in America. They are conservative in their opinion page, but their news reporting is not conservative if you judge it by who their sources are. Obviously, if you use more liberal sources than conservative sources, then you're going to have more liberal content in those news stories. And it can cause, whether intentionally or not unintentionally, kind of the effect of what's called in propaganda the inoculation theory of propaganda. In the inoculation theory of propaganda, somebody controlling a news story or news medium would give a very mild dose of one side, a very strong dose of another side. And it's kind of like when you give somebody an inoculation for polio or flu or something. What they do is they put inside you the DNA of the bad virus, and so your body can begin building immunity to that virus because viruses, are change every year, so they have to build up a different, especially when it relates to flu, they have to inject you with different DNA because the flu is different than it was the previous year. So, in a sense, when you give a biased reporting, you are creating the circumstances of the inoculation theory of propaganda. You give your readers or your listeners, viewers, whatever, the impression they're getting both sides, but you have, whether intentional or not, given them a strong dose of one side and a weak dose of the other side. And so, according to the theory, your readers should end up believing the side that in which you provided the strong dose of information. So if you're biasing your selection of news sources, people you interview, and so forth, then that has a potential of biasing your news coverage. So some of the most liberal in that sense were Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, CBS Evening News. In other words, very, very, very major media in America were among the most liberal media in America. Others were also more liberal, using more liberal sources than conservative. And you can see them here. It includes a federally financed national public radio, financed by the U.S. government, uses more liberal sources. Down just a little bit more liberal than conservative is the PBS NewsHour. That's also funded by government money, but that's pretty close to being evenly split. But you see all the other TV networks, Time Magazine, USA Today newspaper, U.S. News and World Report magazine, Newsweek magazine. Anyway, you see all these other media use more liberal sources than conservative sources. The only ones who flip that and use more conservative sources than liberal are the Fox News. Again, this doesn't count their commentary. And so Fox News biases their coverage with lots of conservative commentary and discussion. But according to this analysis of just whether they're using conservative or liberal sources, Fox News per se was actually the closest to being basically fair in their selection of news sources. The Washington Times was definitely more conservative than liberal. So 18 out of 20 were using more liberal sources. So no matter what their corporations, their conglomerates, if their conglomerates are conservative, that's not making an impression on the writing of stories, according to the two sources of research. The one about the presidential stories on presidential candidates, and then this one that was more broader in scope. You see, make sure, over in the left, it talks about the control by liberals in America. By liberal conservative means something different, by the way. Let me intercede there. Depending where you live. In America, I'm considered a conservative because I want to conserve what I think are important values about family, religion, um, the intention of the founding fathers in creating the Constitution, the form of government we enjoy, and so forth. And so, in that makes me a conservative. However, I also lived in Kazakhstan for 9 years, and there I was a liberal. I was a liberal because they restrain uh, the free press, they restrain the free speech, they restrain freedom of religion, and so those things are all very dear to me. And so, consequently, in Kazakhstan, you see, I'm a flaming liberal. And so so it kind of depends on the circumstances of where you live and what you're doing. A conservative in one country might be a liberal in a different country. In America, I'm considered a conservative, a pretty strong conservative. In Kazakhstan, a strong liberal. So, but to kind of give you some idea, things like conservatives are typically, not always, but they're typically anti-abortion. And the liberals protect women's rights to kill their unborn children, which, I'm saying that from a conservative perspective, somewhat biased vocabulary, I guess. But that's how conservatives see that. As I said, conservatives would like to see the Supreme Court make decisions on law and so forth based on the intent of the writers of the Constitution, and liberals don't really care about that. They want them to make decisions that favor their policies. Conservatives tend to be for lower taxes, but that hasn't always shown itself in reality. At least with the election of different presidents, sometimes Republican presidents have not been very conservative fiscally. Even though they talked about it, they haven't been. But their position is to be more conservative. What else? Well, conservatives tend to be for a stronger military to protect their country, and liberals tend to think that's not important, and that they'd rather spend more money on social programs. So there's a debate over. Neither side, neither Republicans or the Democrats want to totally destroy national security or public assistance, social programs. But the Republicans would emphasize more, military expenditures and fewer social expenditures than the Democrats would, which is why. But they're kind of afraid to take on the media because the media is liberal. Therefore, sometimes the conservatives who claim to be conservatives end up having bigger budgets than liberals because they're trying to both build the military back up and at least maintain the social programs. So that becomes a conflict with them. Anyway, just to give you an idea what liberal conservative means, the way I'm referring to it. So Hollywood their political causes are 98% liberal. So Hollywood is controlled by liberals. Their donations to candidates are 7-1 to liberal candidates. And I think most of the people in the world realize that Hollywood floods the world with liberal values, and I don't think I need to go beyond that. Another study, and later a book. Oops, okay, I've skipped over another source. There's another source also that did a pretty good study of news media, and he also cited with that of the UCLA and University of Missouri professors and his conclusions as well. And so there are a number of scientific studies that support my premise that, in fact, I'm not even sure that anybody in the media even disputes it anymore. They don't even bother. That the liberals control most of the news media, as well as Hollywood, and they also control universities. So one study here of a survey of almost 2,000 faculty members in 183 universities showed that 72% of them identified themselves as liberal, while only 15% identified themselves as conservative. When they were asked about their parties, it was 50% Democrat, 11% Republican. And in fact, their ideals of a large share, if not a majority, of those who identify themselves as liberal is quite a bit more liberal, more, you might say, socialistic than the typical Democrat has been. Although this year the Democrats are showing a lot more leanings towards socialism in America. So I don't know where to put my picture now. Down here, I guess. So where, oops, typo, do people I don't know, I'm going to have to redo this slide here. Where do people get their news? I guess what I was wanting to write and I didn't. This is a recent study by Oxford University and Reuters News Foundation. This is pretty current figures I just pulled from the internet today. And so, let me get myself out of the way up here. So this is based on a survey in Great Britain. So I know there's going to be some difference between Great Britain and America, but and I'll make note of some, particularly one slide that I think is quite different. But in this case, what it's as far as this slide is showing where do people get their news, and you see that as of 2016, the largest share is not on TV. The largest share is online. And this kind of yellowish line at the top is all online sources, including the traditional media's websites. Down towards the bottom, there's one that's just social. So it's online, but it's social media, basically only. So they're not going to the original newspaper sites or TV sites, whatever, to get their news. And you see what's happening to print. Print is collapsing in their providing of news to the Western consumers. We see, we can look at this also by age. So the blue on the left is a younger generation, 18 to 24. Then comes the red, which is slightly older, 25 to 34. Then you might say gold, I guess, are the 35 to 44-year-olds. The yellow, we'll call it 45 to 54. And green are people like myself in the over 55 group. And so you see online media, including social media, as their primary source of news. The young people, 84% online, whereas older people like myself, it's still 21%, only 21% are getting their main news from online. You can go over on the TV, you see that my age group is primarily getting their news from TV still, 54%. Anyway, so as you look at this, you realize how things are moving towards online. And among the younger generation, a lot of them, 24%, are getting theirs just from social media. Now, again, in that first grouping, online, overall online, 84%. So if you add those together, I guess the 84 would include social media because it doesn't separate them. So 84% of the younger generation is getting their primary news online from some source. About more than a quarter of which is just doing it from social media, as seen in that second group. From print media, among the younger people, only 4% of young people get their news from newspapers anymore. Whereas with the older generation, 15% in my generation is still reading the newspaper as their primary source. But that's a big collapse, 15%. But even among the older people, they have given up on newspapers. And that will reflect itself as we go to some other statistics. Another one from that study, this is just how many online news sources are used by people depending on whether they use social media or don't use social media. So those who don't participate in social media, they basically only have one main source and maybe maybe two. Some of them have two, some of them have one. So they're pretty stuck in the traditional sources. Whereas those who use social media at all have about 3 different sources of news they typically use. With those who use search engines, if they don't do search, then they have about 2 sources. Again, those would probably be primarily traditional media. It doesn't really identify that, but if they do use search a lot, then they have closer to 4 sources of news that they use. Do you trust the media? This is where I think America would be very different than Great Britain. Because here, the group that trusts the media the most are those who are conservative on the right. And those that trust it least here are liberals and the left. And I'd say that's flipped in America, at least flipped. I'm sure of it. I haven't gone to get some statistics to show that, but I've read statistics that would say it's just the opposite in America. That they are the conservatives that don't trust traditional media anymore. And the liberals are pretty satisfied with the reporting of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the TV stations. So this is very different between Great Britain and America. And you see that there are very few people who call themselves news lovers, and they define it here: extremely interested in news and access 5 times a day. I would find myself probably in that category, although my access is kind of mixed up too. So, and even, by the way, there is some ridicule of people who access news through social media, but you can use social media to access news quite well, in that if you follow the news media. So I use social media a lot for accessing the news because I follow both liberal and conservative media. I follow Fox, I follow Washington Times, I follow New York Times, I follow Washington Post, I follow the different TV station networks, NBC, CBS, ABC. So I'm getting some fair and balanced coverage of news media while I'm in social media. But at the same time, I get to respond to it and give my opinions and promote those stories with which I happen to agree. So I'm both accessing the news and sharing my opinions and perspectives at the same time. Anyway, there's 37% who basically pretty much ignore the news in this survey. 44%, the largest group, 44% access the news, about once a day or so. So they want to. No, excuse me, it says 1 to 5. So the other ones is greater than 5. So they access news. I'd say a lot of those must be people like myself who access news through the social media. If they're doing it anywhere close to 5 times a day, they're doing a lot of access in different sources. But that was supported by the previous slide as well. So this is kind of a large range to group into daily briefings. I think if they access it 5 times a day or 4 times a day, that's not. I think they're getting pretty close to being news lovers if they're accessing it for any length of time, and that doesn't suggest an answer to that question. How big a length of time do you have to be counted, to spend on a media to be counted as a news lover or briefer? Anyway, nonetheless, there does seem to be strong evidence that people are starting to as they go online, they don't pay as much attention to news anymore. So, what is happening to traditional news media while while people are starting to go online for their news and entertainment both? Where there's a term called tipping point, and I'll refer to that as we go along. Tipping point is where suddenly something builds and builds, like this guy pushing this rock up to the top of the hill, and then once it gets to the tipping point, it takes off on its own and goes really fast. And we see that sort of tipping point in a number of ways, especially in recent decades with the changes in technology. And you'll see them here in these numbers that I show you. So this is comparing the advertising revenue with the newspaper, print, and digital revenue. Let me bring this down long so you can read the headline. Unite U.S. newspaper, print, and digital revenues versus Google ad revenues. Now I'll put my photo back up there. So you see that in 2003, which was not that long ago, I mean, yes, it's 16 years ago, but that's still, and well, we're in the middle of 2019, so you say 15 years ago of completed years. Google hardly existed comparatively. It was already a billion-dollar company, so that's, maybe it's not fair to say it hardly existed, but it wasn't like, again, this chart stops in 2014, and I can guarantee that those numbers become more contrasting since 2014. I just haven't updated this slide. Well, you see the newspapers controlled the advertising during the early parts of the 2000s, and then Google came up and up and up and made a major jump, or I guess you could say it either way. Newspapers collapsed in 2009 and Google took off. But there were some collapsing in 2008, but even back to, I think, in 2005, the former executive editor of the Washington Post said they were doing so well in 2005 that they were hiring people. They had 900 people on their news staff for the Washington Post. Washington Post was a huge company doing fantastic. And then the next year, 2006, they started laying people off. They started lowering. So they're hiring people in 2005. I don't know if they're firing people, but they weren't replacing people, at least in 2006. So their numbers were coming down. They started trying to force people into retirement, and even the executive editor by 2008 was no longer there. He was now off the payroll. So they were pushing people out the door by 2008. And you see it just continued to collapse to where in 2014, the newspapers were down to about 1/3 in the print advertising, what they were before, that's in green. And yet they had not built up much revenue from their online advertising, which is in black. Whereas meanwhile, Google was taking off. And so by 2014, it was more than 3 times, and by now is probably has 4 times the revenue of all the newspapers in America combined. So likewise, you can look at it from this perspective. They were up, total revenues were around $50 billion. Bring this handsome guy down a little bit. In 2005 and in 2014, they were, close to, third that amount. And yet, if you look at the amount of their digital advertising revenues, it didn't do much. They have not figured out how to make money, to move their advertising online. And I have some opinions on that, or how they could, but that's not for today. This table just shows the increased use of mobile phones. Mobile media are becoming more and more dominant in America. And you see in 2014, so about the time that that last chart ended, people were seriously getting into mobile phones, but still it wasn't dominating as it is today. I'll bring the projection for this year, 2019 and 2020, is basically almost everybody has a mobile phone in America. You have still the older generation over 65, and some people can't even, at that age, can't even talk on any kind of phone. They're in nursing homes and stuff. So that's, and many of those who are still strong and healthy still don't choose to have mobile phones. And then you see down at those that are 0 to 11 years old, that they're almost to 50% of those. 0? Are you kidding me? Have their own mobile phone. Or they said users, mobile phone users. And I see lots of little children using mobile phones and mobile devices for entertainment purposes, even if they don't use it that much as a phone per se. So here are the internet users by device. You see, again, the gray is dual. They use both mobile devices and desktop or laptop devices. That number is still pretty high. In fact, that number is actually seen to continue growing through 2020. But the number of people who only use desktop or laptops is diminishing. So it was nearly a third of the people in 2014, and by 2020, I think they'll be down to 10% of the people. So about 1/3, as many as those as in 2014 were only desktop, laptop users. And there's also mobile that are they only use mobile, and that number among young people is growing, particularly that they don't have desktops or even laptops anymore. They're totally mobile. And that number has been growing, as you see here. Mobile only, they predict by next year, 2020, to be, 41, million people in America. So as opposed to 227 using both and 10 million. So it's not percent, it's million, I guess. So I think I referred to this percent a second ago, but these numbers are in millions of people. This here, the use of tablets, percent of population and percent of internet users, not particularly important to me here. This is the US TV ad spending versus digital. You see, as they pointed out in a previous slide, 2016 was a crossing point where the digital media overtook TV in America. But now you see where it's going. And by 2020, they project that the digital media advertising spending will be not yet double TV, but it's going to be there. I mean, the TV revenues are dropping and digital revenues are increasing rapidly. And I think that number is going to be more stark as we proceed, as we go. We're going to hit a major tipping point soon with TV, I believe. The same sort of tipping point that we saw 15 years ago in newspapers, we're about to experience, and that's the next few slides, I think, will show that. This is actually in the recent years, local TV stations have, where to move me over here, I guess. Local TV stations have been the most profitable ever. But the problem is, and the reason why I think we're about to hit a tipping point, is that they are profitable because of what's called retransmission fees. The local TV stations have to be paid by cable companies covering their area if they use their local news coverage, for example, or local TV coverage. And so you see that the number or the amount of money that in billions of dollars being paid to local TV stations is quite significant. By 2020, they're approaching $10 billion in local retransmission fees. Well, so the local TV stations look like they're profitable right now, but there's a problem and a tipping point around the corner. And that's because the cable news coverage and use of cable overall is shrinking. We see the change here between 2009 and 2014. Again, that's not very updated, but we see a dramatic drop in cable news right here. This is by age range again, what's going on, and have never had pay TV. You see the younger from 18 to 29, about half of them have never paid for TV. In other words, they've never paid for cable or satellite, anything like that. Now, those who are older there's fewer of them who have never paid for TV, although still significant numbers. You also see in the among the younger generation, they don't use as many add-on services from the cable companies. And you see that a lot of people just in the last few months or whatever, or in the previous period of time, previous year, I think this is related to, during the previous year, a lot more people are canceling their cable, and that number is growing fairly rapidly. The younger generation actually shows fewer, but that's because they didn't sign up to start with. So that number looked like it's good news, but the bad news over on the other side is that half of them never had cable, so they don't have anything to cancel. And this was part of that same survey. How likely are you to cancel pay TV within 6 months? And you see that there were about 20%, actually more like 21%, who were somewhat likely to cancel in the next 6 months. And this was done in 2015. And that number, it's not real clear here whether they count. I think they're not counting in this things like Netflix, which are digital media. And so here we're talking about, again, cable or satellite TV. And so even in 2015, these numbers were growing very rapidly. And I think we're hitting the tipping point to where we're going to see massive people abandoning cable. Part of that is because pay online services like Netflix are becoming better and better, and there are more competitors there now. In the last year or so, Netflix spent $8 billion on their own original programming. I believe it was Disney was going to come into the market with their own service and spend about $2 billion. There were other companies also planning to increase their expenditure of original programming, while at the same time they're paying to use programming created by Hollywood or by the TV networks. They're paying for that to put onto their websites because the TV networks are going to take their money any way they can get it, even though it could eventually kill them. So here, I guess it's kind of hard to read, but this is Netflix over here. So you can see this is use of different online media, and Netflix was soaring and it's continuing to soar. YouTube is soaring and continuing to soar. Hulu was doing pretty well. They're a lot higher than this now. Amazon was number 2 then and probably still is. Amazon is very, very strong. So these are the 4 biggest players still. Netflix, YouTube, Amazon, and Hulu. But there, like I say, are other organizations coming into it. HBO is going to start offering a separate service or is offering now. Even sports, ESPN is offering separate coverage. Organizations like the National Basketball Association offers that separate coverage. National Football League offers separate coverage. So there's lots of entertainment that is moving online. So again, my point here is I think we're about the tipping point for TV. The networks are they won't be able to get as much revenue from their affiliates because their affiliates are going to start disappearing unless they come up with a new formula. I do have some ideas for them, but I don't have a chart here, but the amount of advertising they've been able to move online is just as bad as with newspapers. Neither one of them has been successful in moving advertising onto their website. And so once local TV stations start losing their retransmission fees from cable, they're very likely to collapse very quickly. So one of the questions I raise, are we looking more at the impact of fragmentation or conglomeration? That there are impacts, negative impacts from both. Fragmentation will be from people going online and getting their news from things like social media. Aren't really good news. They're not news creators really, so they are not as trustworthy unless you're following the traditional media on social media like I do. What you're likely to get is a lot of junk. And I admit that, even though a lot of that junk may be coming from conservative sources who are trying to fight the impact of the liberal-controlled media. It's not as professional and sometimes has inaccuracies, and there are some on both sides that just put out lies, propaganda lies of a variety of natures. But as far as what's happening overall with news coverage, we are seeing fragmentation and conglomeration, intense, stronger conglomeration, where perhaps we will be down to just the three major companies. And even now, some of those conglomerates, it doesn't show their ownership of local TV stations, so that's probably where it's not quite accurate. But as far as national news sources, even some of those six do not own any major general news sources. So the ownership of international and well-known news providers is less than 6 already, and it could be down to 3 as was projected pretty soon. But at the same time, we have fragmentation with anybody who wants to can start their own news channel on the internet for a few relative pennies. Compared to what it costs to start a TV station or something like that. That's many millions of dollars to do that, or to start a daily newspaper, many millions of dollars to do that. But to start a small news publication, or what they're calling what do they call it? News sites that kind of reshare news from other sites, from other real providers, original providers. There's lots of those, and so they also take away advertising from the creators of the media. If they're sharing the media elsewhere, and they're not drawing those people back to the original sources, then those original sources are also going to lose advertising. So we have fragmentation, conglomeration. I say what I didn't put on here is polarization. Is that the media are becoming increasingly polarized, and they are causing the populace in America, the people, to become increasingly polarized. That's another issue. Okay, so I'll end there. I just wanted to point out some of the things happening that, but I would most importantly, I think if you're asking the question of who is the source of fake information, then I'd refer you back to that original slide of those those videos that I referred you to towards the start of this. Sharyl Attkisson, for example, has lots and lots of examples of strong traditional media not acting ethically. Some of those statistics where right around 90% of all the stories, much, much worse than the bias you saw in those slides about during the campaign between Bush, in the Bush campaign, his victory, and in Obama's campaign, the 2-to-1 negative to positive between the Democrat and Republican, or in other words, the conservative, getting much worse coverage than the liberals. And now, like I say, somebody has pulled the plug on that research organization and said, no, you're not going to cover this anymore. And so now that they're not covering it, under Trump, it's 92% negative news coverage of Donald Trump. That is way beyond chance, let me put it that way. And some will respond, well, but he's the devil, whatever. He's the next Hitler, whatever you want to say. That's definitely not fair coverage. So we've got that problem. Sharyl Attkisson is talking again about control of news, even by drug companies and stuff like that. That should concern everyone, conservative or liberal. When you see the evidence she has, it's quite alarming. Whereas on the other side, as I said, the former executive editor of Newsday, I think is too much of an apologist for traditional media. There is plenty of evidence that they're biased. Plenty of evidence. In fact, now you'd have to laugh at them with the degree of negative coverage of Donald Trump. Any claim that they're not biased would be laughable. They are definitely partisan at this point. So, as they are partisan, is what they produce fair? Or is it, in a sense, fake? And if you watch the videos, you'll be able to ponder that question. I would, as a longtime journalist myself, I hate to call traditional media fake, but it is extremely biased. And in some cases, I talked previously about the inoculation theory of propaganda. In a way, biased news coverage by traditional media is more dangerous than fake news, in a way, or at least as dangerous, because they are implementing a major theory of propaganda. They make people think that they're fair and objective, and they're not being fair and objective. And they haven't been for many years, but it's becoming astoundingly partisan at this point from my perspective. And I'm coming from the perspective of a conservative, but there are scientific studies too, and just surveys. But I would say, for example, it is impossible. Again, those self-identifying surveys where journalists identify themselves as liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat, whereas 5-to-1 liberal to conservative, and that, like I say, I think may be getting worse, but at least no better. So if you have 5 times as many liberals in the news media as conservatives, how it's impossible for it not to be biased. There are psychological factors we call, cognitive dissonance, causes people to kind of resist things that they don't understand, that conflict with the way they think. Selective perception, how you perceive things, even if you don't mean to misperceive them, you misperceive them depending on how you think, your biases and so forth, what I would call your conceptual framework. The selective exposure, what do you even expose yourself to as far as information goes? All those things cause people, even well-intentioned people, to express biases. That is just psychology. Many years ago, I did a study related to this, and I won't get into all the background to it, but in this study, I wanted to see two things. First off, were the people in the middle of the road less likely to expose themselves to more information, to information with which they disagree, than were those at the extremes. Previous presumptions and studies had suggested that people at the extremes are the ones who are what they call dogmatic. And it depends very much on how you want to define dogmatic. And there was the originator of the term, I felt, had a very biased tool in measuring dogmatism if you equate dogmatism with closed-mindedness, unwillingness to look at other ideas and other information, conflicting information. And so one of the questions, for example, was, would you accept a free subscription to a publication with which you strongly disagreed, and would you read it? Those at the extremes were more likely to say yes than those in the middle of the road. People in the middle of the road are very content, and they are very strongly supported in their thinking by the traditional media. At least they have been. The more liberal it gets, the more that's not true. But they had been, at least when I did my survey, it was perceived that the media were just slightly more liberal than the middle of the road citizen. And so media and other people around them supported the thinking of the middle of the road. Now, I pointed out in that study that middle of the road, in case you think that, well, of course, most people believe the truth. Truth is in the middle of the road. Well, the trouble with that idea is that the middle of the road has shifted dramatically over the decades. Anybody who has, thinks like they did in the 1950s would be considered to be somebody like the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, they'd be so conservative that even conservatives now would disown them. And so, whereas, what is considered the norm of, the middle of the road today would in the 1950s would have been considered socialist. I mean, it's just so that over the time of my lifespan, the middle of the road has changed dramatically. And so you can't conclude that the middle of the road is always right, because the middle of the road is always changing. So that was one perspective that I had going into this. The other thing I did was I asked two questions about the future that would, in essence, be impossible to know the answer to. One of them was, do you expect the U.S. economy to get worse, get better, or stay about the same over the next 10 years? A lot happens economically in 10 years. 10 years ago, we had the Great Recession, and now it's doing well under, at least in America, doing well under Trump. 10 years before the 2008, there was a recession, but in between, the economy was doing well. So over a 10-year span, lots happens, and very frequently it's just the opposite of what it was at the original time frame. So again, I asked them to choose between three, which, like I said, I don't think you could really knowingly have strong knowledge that would allow you to guess 10 years in the future with the economy. But that wasn't really what I was concerned with. I then asked them, how sure are you that you are right? So from my perspective, with the question I asked, they should have been about, if they were fair, only had like a 33 to 35% belief that they were correct in their prediction. But instead, their prediction was up around 70, so about double what it should have been. And it didn't matter whether they're liberal or conservative or moderate. It didn't matter where they were all pretty much grouped up around 70%, thought that they could predict the future based on their understanding and their paradigm that their conceptual framework provided them. And then I asked, and this, by the way, was in, like I said, a long time ago. This was in 1978, in that era. So it was almost exactly 10 years before the collapse, or the almost collapse, the collapsing momentum to the Soviet Union. And so nobody thought that was going to happen. I never heard anybody even said ever, no matter how smart or stupid they were, in that period of time, I never heard anybody suggest that the Soviet Union would disappear in 10 years. And so the reality was beyond projection. Nobody could have guessed what was happening by the time you got to 1988 and 1989. But again, I asked them, what do you think will happen between, in the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union? It'll get better, it'll get worse, it'll stay the same. During that period of time, about 5 years into that time frame, the Democrats were running ads against Ronald Reagan, saying that Ronald Reagan would start World War III. Well, 5 years later, he was doing just the opposite. He was ending the Cold War with the Soviet Union and overseeing the collapse of the Soviet Union altogether. So, and again, I asked them, how sure are you, whatever it was they predicted, how sure are you that you're right? And again, it's almost identical to the question about the economy. They were about 70% sure they were right. So my point is that all of us have a different paradigm, and whether we're projecting into the future, our expectations of the future, our interpretation of the past, our understanding of the present is being controlled to a large degree by our personal paradigm. And we're sure that we're right. All of us are. Some of us are more correct than others, that we are definitely right. But so with that perspective, can a news organization who has 5 times as many liberal journalists than conservative journalists do provide fair news coverage, even if it wanted to? They would have to be extremely strict in demanding equal number of sources, which we did not see, which the UCLA and Missouri professors did not find in their analysis. They were not using the same number of sources, and that's just one indicator. There's other ways too. What story do you consider important? Which stories are you going to cover, and which ones are you going to ignore? During this period of Trump's presidency, the liberal media have largely ignored his successes, like the economy, and they've piled on and reported story after story about his collusion with the Russians, how badly he did with his discussions with North Korea or Russia or whatever. Everything is from a very negative framework, and which has led to an average of 90% negative news and very little coverage of his successes, or even his perspective on things like on the border. Lots and lots of coverage of his enemies, about the wall and the treatment of immigrants who get caught at the border, stuff like that. Lots of negative stories, not very many explaining from the perspective of the Border Patrol, for example, what's going on with those that they have to capture, and why they don't have as much, they can't provide as good accommodations as they might like, stuff like that. Very little coverage of that by the traditional media. So it's not just bad coverage of Trump, but it's bad coverage of anybody associated with Trump. In this case, the Border Patrol, and so forth. So it seems increasingly difficult to have a nonpartisan journalistic reporting in America, anyway. Maybe not as much in other countries. So, okay, well, so who provides fake news? That's your decision, I guess, but watch those videos.